In Japan, the $150,000 Toyota Century sits atop the Toyota lineup as its full-size luxury sedan, and soon it could be joined by an SUV. Hey, I'm Creech, and this is Creech and Cars, where I talk about car news, history, and culture. And today, I'm going to be going over everything we know so far about a potential Toyota Century SUV. I'll go over the possible design and performance specs, and then I'll give my thoughts on whether or not I think it will actually be produced. But first, here's a quick refresher on the normal Century sedan. The Toyota Century is an ultra-luxury full-size sedan that is only sold in Japan. It debuted all the way back in 1967, and it occupies a segment that is comprised of models like the Bentley Flying Spur and Rolls-Royce Ghost. But unlike those models, which are used as flashy symbols of extravagant wealth, the Century is reserved for Japanese officials and businessmen, and it's actually more comparable to something like the Beast Cadillac that the US president uses. The Century is only sold in Japan because it is for Japanese people who don't want to be seen in a foreign car, but also need the privacy and serenity that only an ultra-luxury car can provide. The Century uses very classy and understated design cues so that it looks nice without being gaudy. And while a V12 was offered at some point, the current generation powered by a 5.0 liter V8 and an electric motor that total about 425 horsepower. Of course, the interior of the Century is very nice and similar to models from Rolls-Royce, especially with rear passengers being the main focus. There are a few touches that are unique to the Century, like wool seats instead of leather. In Japan, wool is considered to be the ideal seating surface, however, leather is available. There are also very vintage looking curtains for the back passengers instead of modern looking sunshades. So what could we expect from an SUV version? Well, reports suggest that it could be built off of the Toyota Highlander. While the Highlander is smaller than the Sequoia and Land Cruiser, it might just be easier for Toyota engineers to modify the architecture of the Highlander and use its hybrid powertrain. I do suspect the wheelbase would be lengthened no matter what vehicle the Century is based on. We could also expect it to look very similar to the Century sedan, as it's just going to be an SUV version of that sedan. In these unofficial renderings, we can see a hypothetical Century SUV with the same classy and elegant looks, just on a slightly bigger scale. The grille is small by modern standards and much smaller than Lexus SUVs. There are also nice looking LED headlights up front. There's a decent amount of chrome accenting around the boxy body, and I'm a huge fan of the wheels used here. There's a wide hip, and as we come around to the rear, it wouldn't be a new car without a light bar. The rear light design is probably my least favorite thing about this rendering, but overall I think it looks very good. Making our way into the interior, we can see a lot of similarities to the Century sedan's interior, but I think the artist who made this rendering took a few design cues from Rolls-Royce as well. The rendering looks a little more modern, with fully digital gauges and a large center screen. The steering wheel is updated as well, but still has the classic Century logo, which by the way is just a Japanese phoenix. The door panels are trimmed with large wood slabs, and there's a mix of black and tan leather. The seats have wool inserts but are trimmed in the tan beige leather. Here's another version of the interior. I think the actual interior would look more like the first image, as this one is a little too modern and techy and doesn't really go with the classy image of the Century. It also gets rid of the wool, and while the sedan does offer an all-leather version, wool seats are much more typical. Moving on to the rear, there are a few more tweaks to the design, and while I don't particularly like these, I think they do capture a rear seat that is equal parts luxury and business. Each passenger gets a large screen attached to the back of the front seats, and there's a large center console that can be used for storage and as a table and workspace. There would also likely be tables built into the back of the front seats that can be pulled out. There are several other little screens and buttons, and you can be sure that the Century SUV would match Rolls-Royce or Bentley in terms of features for the rear passengers. So if that's what a Century SUV might look like, what would power it? While the Century sedan is a hybrid that still uses a big naturally aspirated V8, reports from Nikkei in Japan suggest that the SUV version would use Toyota's hybrid max powertrain. This means it would use a similar powertrain to models like the Toyota Crown and of course the Highlander. The Crown uses a 2.4 liter turbo 4-cylinder and combines that with an electric motor to produce about 340 horsepower. The report suggests that the Century SUV would use something similar to the Crown, but with a 3.5 liter engine. I suspect that Toyota would use the 3.5 liter engine and at least one electric motor to try to get the power output closer to the sedan's 425 horsepower number, and maybe even a little more. As even with a good amount of power, the Century won't be quick. It's very heavy, and speed and acceleration just aren't priorities. However, the Century would have a very smooth and soft ride and be incredibly quiet on the inside even at higher speeds. Now with all that information in mind, will the Toyota Century SUV actually be produced? I think the days of ultra luxury cars only being sedans are over, with models like the Cullinan, Bottega, and GLS Maybach, as well as the fact that more people in general are just driving SUVs than ever before. So it makes sense for automakers across size and price ranges to produce more SUV models. That being said, the decision to make a Century SUV would come down to specifically what wealthy businessmen and diplomats in Japan want, as well as how Japanese people would receive the SUV version. Unlike in America where bigger is always better, bigger cars typically don't sell very well in Japan. It's just inconvenient for most people to navigate the tight streets in congested cities. The best-selling cars in Japan are still SUVs and crossovers, just very compact ones. In fact, the Century sedan is already a massive car in Japan, being compared to K cars and just other smaller compact vehicles. So while this is technically just a rumor, for those reasons I don't think making an SUV version of the Century is out of the realm of possibility. I actually think it's quite likely for Toyota to make an SUV version that has a similar wheelbase and just a taller roofline. And while that SUV might not be big by American standards, it would have a ton of presence in Japan without being massive and flashy. One last thing I want to go over with the Century SUV is that I've seen some people wondering whether or not it might come to America. And while Americans love buying expensive SUVs, and Toyota would certainly make more money by offering the vehicle overseas, that's just not the point of the Century. This is a vehicle made specifically for Japanese people, and Toyota would want it to remain a symbol of honor and not have it end up in a music video in Los Angeles. People have also brought up the fact that Toyota is now bringing the Crown to America as a near luxury car, but that's ignoring the different purposes that the Century and Crown serve in Japan. As Americans, we can see the Crown and Century as both being luxury Toyotas that aren't branded as Lexuses, but the truth is the Crown in Japan is just a near luxury family sedan that's akin to something like the Avalon in America. The Crown isn't comparable at all to the Century in Japan. So to sum everything up, I think the Toyota Century SUV is coming in the near future, but the only way to get one in the United States will be to wait 25 years. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, check out some of the other videos on the channel and subscribe so you don't miss future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.